the will of the humans, that they are bound to, that the robots will not harm another human. And then the third law basically being that you can basically retroactively decide which law to break at the point at which the robot's own safety and human safety is basically being compromised. So with that framing in mind, what I'm going to be basically proving to you from Prime Minister and OG as a whole is the idea that there's a moral justification for doing this, because this is a natural extension of the manner in which the human agent who would be driving the car, or who would be operating the machinery, or who would be doing the operation under which the robot is operating, is going to be acting in a similar manner. I'm going to arrive at this with three basic frames, and the plausible understanding of this debate is that we are going to be inculcating a set of Kantian or virtue ethics framework within the robot, at the point at which we talk specifically about what is the more moral decision to take. Because ultimately, if this is a way up of the trolley problem, then the added calculus, or the added incentive, or the added framing in this case is that one of the agents who might end up losing their life are the agent that you know, are the humans that you specifically are assigned to, are the humans that you can, on a operational basis, but also just on a developmental basis, able to gauge the value of life a lot more fruitfully, which means on the virtue of what Kantian ethics apply, you can gauge the goodwill of the decision that you're making, which makes you the morally good actor in this case. How does the AI work? Number one, where is the goodwill of the agent confirmed? Number three, why is this justifiable? How does the AI work? We don't want outlandish frames of what sentient AI or what the singularity can do, because we are far removed from achieving that kind of singularity, probably about 50 to 60 years, if not 100 years. You need massive amounts of upgrades in memory technology, or even in quantum computing, to be able to achieve the kind of sentience that humans have. Meaning, the kind of decisionality that happens on our side of the house, and likely in both sides of the house, is based on stochastic reasoning, usually through probability trees analysis or fault trees analysis, through which you arrive at a conclusion on which life should be saved, basically prioritizing the decision, right? You basically, like the ways in which AI ends up working, which is a glorified manner in saying that you have machine learning, is basically a lot of inculcation, a lot of learning, and a lot of error decidability and error weaning out, or basically deciding which errors can be ignored, which errors can be inculcated and learned further from, in order to create a machine or an agent that can somewhat resemble the decisional calculus in which how humans work. Note, even in this case, there is a lot of propensity for false positives and false negatives arising within the workings of the AI, particularly at the point at which the value presumption on which you're going to be making the decision is something that is sketchy, i.e. one that you cannot fully prioritize, or one that you cannot fully base the context of. In this case, from a human perspective, this is basically about, I know that I value the life of my child, I know that I value the life of my wife, or I know that I value the life of my uncle. I can't specifically make that trade-off in terms of contexts of people who are outside on the road when I might be speeding, or the car might be speeding because my kid might be sick, or I can't make up the contextual evaluation of lives of people who might be hurt in the process, because ultimately the goodwill of wanting to save my own child's life or my own loved interest's life is much more important than the random actors on our side of the house. Note, in the context of AI, this uniquely inculcates, or at the point at which you start trying to draw context about the people who you're going to be trying to save, even on the utilitarian basis, you basically increase the propensity and plausibility through which there will be a lot more errors, which means either on worst case side, you have no decision being made, or an even destructive case or a destructive decision being made, which means people who might be hurt, or people who end up getting hurt in accidents, or people who end up getting hurt because of car speeding, become a lot more realistic at the point at which those faulty decisions are likely. Note, this is basically how the development of the AI on a mechanistic level, but on a structural level, uniquely works, because of the manner the development in and of itself and the math-based workings in which you make the evaluation is made. The whole idea of conditional probability basically means that there is always a margin for error, and oftentimes, due to these errors building up, there's always a trade-off or an understanding that some of these errors are some things that we simply have to live with, which is often the reasons why even right now AI and self-driving cars are still very careful with the kind of technology that they are inculcating, because of the fact that road safety is something that you have to necessarily take into account. Note, why is this uniquely justifiable on our side of the house? But before that, CO.
In the context of you driving a car with a sick child, obviously you cannot make a valuation on the lives of the pedestrians outside. But why does that allow you to disregard those lives?
I mean, the point of the matter is that if the question comes between the child's life and the pedestrian's life, at the point at which if you don't go over the speed limit or if you don't break those certain signals, and the child is likely to die because they don't get the urgent care that they need, we're basically saying that this is where we prioritize the life of the child, which the owner of the car or whoever's driving the car or just sitting at the driving wheel is likely to prioritize as well. Why is this important in terms of the ethical connotations, but more importantly in terms of the human connotations of this? Note the ethical connotations I already alluded to earlier in my speech, i.e., you can't fully justify or decide on the contextual value of numerous lives being saved versus singular life being saved. That is the ethical conundrum of the trolley problem in a nutshell. Note, however, from the point of view of Kantian overview ethics, you're able to at least understand what's the goodwill of the actor if you know which decision you will be taking or not taking. In the case where you don't know whether you know that one person or whether you know the five people, not taking a decision obviously makes sense. But at the point at which you know the one person, you know that one person is someone that you necessarily care for and you necessarily want to save them because you understand the values of their life, you understand their motivations, you understand their dreams, you obviously have a goodwill in the form when you choose to act for them and when you choose to save their life. And that is basically the kind of goodwill under which we believe that it's perfectly justifiable for the robot to act. But more importantly, even if that doesn't make sense, the idea that this is the humanist extension on how you would want the machine to act at the point at which this machine is an extension of how you want your operations to go forward as well, or how you would want to act at the point at which this life and death scenario does become plausible, we're telling you that this is perfectly legitimate for humans to expect that out of an appliance or out of a machine that does not have full sentience, but is basically mimicking it just to make our lives easier. That is the basis under which you make this technology more accessible and more easier to buy, but more importantly, just more moral and justifiable under all frames as well. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Let's have Hello. Hello.
Okay. Can you hear me? Just a mic check. Is my voice clear?
All good.
I'll start in a second or so. Okay. Starting in three, two, starting in three, two, one. If I were to summarize opening government's case, I have three things to say. Firstly, the case is that given that humans would always act in the nature of own self-preservation, therefore artificial intelligence should also act in the same way, because basically humans are their own moral agents and therefore AI should also be selfish because humans are. Secondly, they use a weird distorted form of Kantian argument of how individuals ought to act on the basis of categorical imperative. Firstly, onto the idea of natural extension of how humans would react in these same situations. Firstly, we do not think it goes to the extremes of saying that a mother has to make a choice between her dying child, or mother has to make a choice between other individuals. In most and in majority of the cases, this would be people who are trying to save their own lives while at the cost of often being confronted with lives of other individuals, which we think would be the majority of these cases in this debate. We think this would look like driving a car, but also other sophisticated piece of artificial intelligence. But we are also going to broaden this debate because we think in with each and year and each and every decade, we are seeing more sophisticated form of artificial intelligence, which is more capable of emulating human sentience, which is more capable of emulating human morality. We think this debate exists in that world because we think to some extent we presume that we can impart those values to the machine. Firstly, we do not think that humans, firstly, we think humans shape their own morality through experience and they aren't programmed. That's the first distinction, because we do not think that it's a natural extension, because in humans' case, we often form a morality through experience, through interaction, and through observations, which same isn't true for machines. It's often something which is programmed. Secondly, it's not a natural extension, because we think in largely in society, we have morally virtuous things such as helping other individuals, such as making sure that we do not cause harm to other individuals for our own selfish interest. We think this is often the case in majority of the cases as human morality shaped for years. But thirdly, they talk about Kantian idea. We think the idea of Kantian argument is that you have to do good regardless of outcomes. So your action shouldn't be dependent upon what the outcome would be, which means a mother who has to send her soul has to send her child to war ground or battleground, she should do so because she can look at a bigger goal that she is contributing to, which is the safety of our nation. And this happens in majority of these cases. Parents and close people make sacrifices, letting their child go away, letting their close ones go away, because we think we are doing for a greater purpose. Therefore, the idea of distorted Kantian logic doesn't really work about. But secondly, on our constructive material, firstly, I'm going to talk to you about two principal arguments. Then I'm going to talk about the capacity of human misuse, and then I'm going to talk about how AI can be subject to massive human programming and one that creates animosity between AIs and humans. On to my principal argument. What is AI? We think AI is simply a sophisticated piece of machinery that exhibits high order human like intelligence and can simulate it. In this debate, we are going to presume it exists on a scale, which is to say it can be a very soft AI, a very weak AI, one which can only do a parts of portions of human intelligence. But we are also going to presume that in upcoming decades, we are moving towards more and much more updated piece of AI, which means one will also have higher level of intelligence. That is to say, in those instances, we would particularly say that human well-being is often one which is arbitrary. That is to say, me choosing to save someone over the other life doesn't really have a moral standard to begin with. Oftentimes, my actions are driven by instinctive responses and intuitions that aren't always in alignment with what larger objective morality is. Why is that important? One, because we think ethics in society, such as saving others' life over your own life, help us to build a consensus. Why is that consensus so important in the society? One, because we think ethics allow us to build an objective consensus on altruistic behavior, because we think we all argue that human safety is paramount, then we all can strive towards not harming each other, as opposed to a world in which every human wants to save themselves at the cost of harming other individuals, which means on a net utility, you harm more individuals out of the day, because the way in which you prioritize someone else's life over your own life over someone else's life is always going to be on arbitrary grounds. It never can be something which is driven by rational approach. It often is based upon how much you love those people or how much instinctively you are close to those individuals. However, take the comparative, which is opposition, which is in we all agree to a consensus. We all agree to a standard and objective metric, which is that, hey, we all are going to care about each other's lives and we are going to protect someone else's life. In that world, individuals are more likely to protect someone else, which means even if you someday are at the line of harm, some person will choose to save you while at the cost of harming themselves. We think you're perfectly okay with it, because this sort of morality cuts across random human preferences and make it easier to resolve those ethical dilemmas. We are going to consider this. We think for years this debate has been going on, and we don't think on opposition we have a solution to it. But we think at least this have a better consensus and objective rallying point around the same issue, as we allow it to cut across through those random barriers that individuals face. But more so, if opening government wants to talk about what is actual moral extension of human morality, we think it's much better when human morality is one which is driven by saving others' lives, which is something that easier for individuals to buy into. We think that's much better. On to my practical arguments. One, let's be very clear. We think this debate also envisions a lot of other things that are going to happen in the coming decades. We think there is an existing animosity between humans and AI for obvious reasons. One, we think there is already rising skepticism towards the way in which we see AI is. The reason that skepticism is arising is because we are unsure of what moral certainty is. There is a kind of an epistemic uncertainty to ways humans perceive AI morality or AI's intelligence. We are often scared of the fact that one day they might choose to harm us because they don't have one standard moral agent. When we imbibe them with the values such as, look, you have to protect a human's life over the person who's controlling you, in that world that animosity is reduced, because humans have a huge layer of skepticism and cynicism towards these things when they're unsure of what the moral agent is in that particular situation. We think this is incredibly important for fostering a coexistence of humans and AI in the same world, because in the world in which more and more people are going to own autonomous machines and autonomous vehicles, in that world it's more important that humans can trust those things. Humans are able to trust the functioning of those AIs. Before I move on, does closing has a POI? If they're not, OG can go ahead.
Yeah, closing does have a point of information.
Closing, go ahead.
Yeah, the problem with this principled clash that you describe is that AIs very, very, very rarely will have to make these decisions. So why does the principle matter at all if this happens once every 1,000 years?
No, actually, this is not true. We think, given that we are going to use these things on almost day-to-day lives, these decisions are going to be very important. These decisions are going to affect our day-to-day actions. I don't think that these are going to happen really. On to my second practical argument, why AI is already subject to human misuse. This is particularly important because we think humans have humongous power over the way AI works, because we have the capacity to program them, feed them data, feed them information, and the ways in which we can use them to extract our own individual benefits. Because this debate isn't just reduced to when they have to make the most moral choices. This also extends to debate where AIs will choose their selfish masters. Oftentimes, people who work in corporations, people who have their own vested interest, which happens a lot of times. Why is it so? One, it will normalize the notion that it's okay for AIs to be not virtuous and to do the thing which helps the most human people, because we can't hold them accountable. It's the not moral standard we use. Secondly, it will allow humans to outsource those real or bad things which they can outsource to AIs, because given that no one really would question AIs, because we do not hold them to same moral standards as we would other human beings. We think this is important because in that world, human gains more power in the way that it can instrumentalize AIs and autonomous vehicles in order to cause harm to other individuals. We do not think humans in the status quo are as much altruistic, but giving them such a device which we won't be able to hold accountable, one which we won't be able to carry or design within the parameters of human morality, it'll be harder for us to live in that world. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Let's have DPM.
No turning on cameras, right?
Yes, please.
Perfect. All right, give me just a second, setting the timer and starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's make one thing pretty clear. This is not a debate about like the fucking Terminator or Westworld. We're talking about realistic AI that exists within status quo. Autonomous vehicles aren't something out of the Jetsons anymore. This is something that's happening in real life, and we need to deal with this in reality. Given this, most of Jose's argumentation being ignored is particularly criminal on opening opposition's part, where they literally talk about shit like people are going to use the AI to kill other people. We think that's literally not possible, given the fact that all artificial intelligence is programmed with the Asimov suite of robotics, which makes sure that machines literally cannot kill other human beings of their own intention, irrespective of even if their owner wills them to do so. Having clarified that, like, half of their harms go away right there. But also, let's talk about this interesting principle that they talk about, right? This concept of like utilitarianism, and because on pure utility, we're saving more lives. See, the interesting thing about that is we are debating like whether or not utilitarianism is a valid moral premise. You kind of need to do more than just assert that it's happening. We'll deal with this specifically and explain to you why the principle that we're running in terms of accessing the good life is a significantly better and significantly more justifiable. But before getting into any of that, let's talk about where these cases are likely to happen. So Zara described one scenario to you to paint a picture for you a little bit, at which point opening opposition obviously comes in and strawmans us and talks about how we're only talking about this extreme minority case. We tell you this is probably going to be talking about like extreme minority cases anyway. So we're talking about traffic accidents. We're talking about like whether or not you decide to speed in a rush when somebody which you know is ill. We think that this is where the vast majority of these decisions take place, and they take place in an extreme minority of cases anyway. The debate then becomes, in those cases, what is the moral and justifiable decision to make? Understand that before we get to any of this, we need to clarify what the purposes of these machines is and why they exist to begin with. This is a unique extension that I hope that should be credited as such. Now, understand that when you buy a blender, for example, the purpose of that blender's existence, given that you now own it and that it doesn't have a sentience or the ability to make its own decisions, is to make you fucking smoothies for the rest of your life. We do not think that blender has any other extraneous purposes or like any other extraneous purposes, such as like making everybody else's smoothie or prioritizing everybody else's smoothie needs. We think that fundamentally every machine that you're operating, given the fact that you own it, fundamentally exists to serve you. Having characterized that, now let's bring back in Jose's case a little bit, right? When we talk to you about how these individuals who own these autonomous machines are necessarily using them as a replacement for like them operating those machines instead. This is particularly important because in status quo, if you are in a situation where, for example, you are headed into a crowded set of vehicles that were probably going to damage like a lot of people there, or you can ram yourself into the side of the road, make sure that you die but nobody else survives. We think you're almost certainly going to opt for like driving into the crowded set of cars, because even if you have a smaller chance of surviving and hurt other people, your prioritization in that instance is to protect yourself. We think that fundamentally, given that the purpose of these machines is to make sure that sorry, is to make sure that the owners get the maximum amount of utility from them. We think that this does not exist if you like literally tell them to kill the owner in those situations. Understand also that the AI operates on a set of probabilities. So in any situation, we're probably not going to be talking about like a lot of people dying as a result of these. Those will happen in extreme minority cases. We think that, for instance, if you have a 6 out of 10 chance of surviving a crash if you ram into the crowd of civilians, but and they have a 4 out of 10 chance of surviving, where alternatively you have a 4 out of 10 chance of surviving if you ram into a wall, and the protesters have a 6 out of 10 chance of surviving. You're probably going to take your chances with the civilians. We think that this is a natural extension in terms of how we operate those machines in status quo. Anyway, before I move forward, I'll take closing.
Why is your entire principle framed around this, a human would do this if he was in that place, morally significant to begin with?
It's morally significant because these are fundamentally machines that are being owned by human beings. These are autonomous machines that exist to replace manual machines. We think that they necessarily have to fulfill the same basic purpose. But also, let's talk about specifically some of the moral analysis that we talked about with respect to justifiability, right? Because I told you this counter analysis with respect to individual utilitarianism. We think utilitarianism, in and of itself, does not have a particularly great amount of value. Why is this the case? We think that our priority within this debate must be to protect the owners of these machines in and of themselves, because they are the people who literally own them. We think that they fundamentally should not be killed by those machines in a situation that perhaps requires them to do so. Why is this the case? I'm so sorry. Why is this the case? We think that on a very basic level, your ability to minimize harm is based on your context, based on the information and the context that you have. So for instance, if your option is between killing one individual and killing 5 individuals, and you do not know anything about anybody else, then not making any particular decision or killing one individual is obviously the moral thing to do in that situation. However, notice that in this particular situation, you do not have that luxury of not knowing anything about anybody else. You in particular, as a machine, have the understanding that, okay, this is very clearly the people that I am supposed to prioritize. The machine, once again, acts as an extension of human morality. We're very happy when opening opposition tells us that human morality is based on the concept of like experiential learning and your priorities as an individual. We think that's cool, but here's the comparative. The AI will never be able to get to a point of human consciousness, because the simple fact is that to emulate human consciousness is literally impossible, at least for the next 100 years, because the simple fact of the matter is that the sheer memory upgrades required are something that we cannot compute at this moment. We don't think that in like 10 years that we're going to get to a point, that in like 10 or 20 or even 50 years, we're going to get to a point where we can actually emulate human morality. However, we think that the closest thing that we can get is to be able to transfer experiential learning and transfer that experiential morality onto these individuals. We think that when you tell the machine, these are the people that you prioritize because these are the people that I personally care about, that is an extension of your morality being applied to your machine. The important phrase in this debate is that understanding that these machines are literally owned by these people. Their fundamental purpose is to fulfill the needs of these people. We think that an extension of how the people would operate the machines if they were manual should be applied to how they are being operated in real life. We think that on that basic extension, it is a significantly more moral decision to prioritize the lives of people that you care about and then you know something about. This is not only because you are able to make more justified decisions, because of the fact that you do not know who the other people are that you're saving. So you could be potentially creating more harm without being aware of it. So for instance, you could kill it, save the life of a terrorist or something. But more importantly than that, your ability to access the good life as an individual is contingent on the fact that you are alive, the people that you love are alive, and that total fucking strangers you don't necessarily care about are not really a huge part of your moral conscience. So sure, you might feel guilty about it later, but in the moment, your ability to access the good life is severely benefited by the fact that you are able to literally live and able to live life with, accompanied by the people that you care about. For all those reasons, because with the side with realistic characterizations of AI, please vote side opening government.
All right, thank you very much. Let's have Diallo. Hello.
Hello, am I audible?
Can you try again?
Yep.
Hi, am I
Okay.
audible? Is this
You're
audible for you?
okay now.
Okay, wait, sorry. I'm so sorry. You're breaking up for me. So I'm just
Yes.
going to do in the chat. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Um, all right, I'll just start. I'm setting up my timer. All right. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. First clarification before we move on to constructive. This is really important because we never argue that robots will go batshit crazy and do whatever they want and it's going to be Westworld. We never thought that was our case to begin with. Let's clarify it, right? We think this applies in cases of like autonomous driving incidents, but also things like where autonomous cars and like AI has more and more power and with growing power in this future. So this debate has some sort of impact on the kind of future you're going to be living in a future where AI will be more powerful. Don't let government run away from that. But secondly, we clarify that this debate isn't going to be happening in a space where a mother has to protect her son particularly. But even if that's the case that we get from entirety of opening government, we'll take them at their best and we'll show you even then why it's not important in this relevant in this debate, right? But first, I think the entire premise is contingent on the idea that somehow this is an extension of a natural sentience like morality that humans are opposed to. That's completely incorrect. We think like Elo talks to you about this, but they completely disregard it and do not respond to it whatsoever. The principle behind it is simple. We don't think, and that's the reason we're having this debate to begin with, because there's a dilemma, a moral dilemma on how humans must act when they're faced with the choice of being selfish versus like saving the greater good, and why the greater good is probably more important. Because notice they never ever tell you why selfishness as a universal principle in terms of like prioritizing your own well-being or prioritizing your own well-being through like by the extension of a robot, it's a good or a better world to live in whatsoever, right? Within that, I think the natural sentiments isn't just to save your, even in our worst case, isn't just to save your son as a mother, right? Which means that like the reason that we talk about this is literally like mothers being able to send their kids to war or sons to war in a world that know they're probably going to be killed, but there's a larger, greater good that they're accede to. But even then, things like people like in religious identities and people who are accede to the larger good, even at the cost of themselves, and that's a form of morality that's naturally very acceptable in society. We have no idea why one is natural and other aren't, and why just by the virtue of being natural, it's a good world to live in. We disagree with that wholeheartedly, right? But secondarily, in terms of like this idea, and then this is what this comes specifically only in DPM, is the idea of how fundamentally like a robot exists to serve you, therefore it must look after you, right? But they never substantiate that. But if the idea is that a service must only substantiate you at the cost of other lives, that's an incorrect world to live in, simply because you have like services like medication, like medicine, where doctors also serve you and you hire and employ them to serve you, but they won't do it at the cost of like going over other people's lives. Absolutely, right? We think that's still an incentive in the world to exist, and we have no consubstantiation from that on opening government. CG, I'll take you the 5th minute. Next, on the idea of probability, right? We think that's where the debate begins. We think the debate begins in a space where like an AI has the ability to probably like save the lives of 5 people, but because you're probably in an like drunk in a car and you're using that car, it's more likely to save you at the cost of like 5 other people and their lives, right? We think the like comparative is very simple. Two things happen. First, the kind of world you live in principally, which we which we're opposed to, but secondarily, things like misuse of that AI, which is much more likely because people can use malicious intents, but even things like careless intent to do the same, which means taking drinking and driving draws more like not as seriously anymore, simply because you're like your life at the end is still going to be saved. So there's no incentive for you to abide by rules of society. The society created for you to participate in altruism to begin with. This is still contingent on the principle we give you on opening up. What is that principle? We think in cases of like what like selfishness looks like and why it's arbitrary to begin with is for 3 reasons. Well-being is arbitrary for 3 reasons. One, it cuts across one another, which means it's always going to be subjective to individuated needs, and it's may always come at the cost of another person. For example, in the US, a right to own a gun may come at the cost of like someone else who like probably not being shot, like or like probably not having those gun laws or like living in a safer society, right? We think these are always at conundrums with each other, but the way you settle that is through the maximum pleasure or the maximum amount of safety you could get in that situation to begin with. Second, it doesn't abide by objective costs, even if it's based on probability. It's focused on like things like focus on things like always prioritizing the needs of one over the other, which means that even if there's a like 70% chance you can save 5 people and like a 65% chance to save the single person, you're still going to save that single person over those 5 people to begin with. That probability is skewed in nature, right? But thirdly, it never allows for altruistic behavior or consensus building to ever take place, which means the extension of morality in the world which you live, and the kind of morality that you will legitimize if you live in government's world, will be one where individual and autonomy will have never been birthed. Why is that so? Because you recognize why altruism and like why the larger and maximum good is important. You're able to understand that people like living prioritizing goodness of most amount of people is something that's important to begin with. But why is that so? Any kind of altruism or understanding that other people need to be helped, even it may be at the cost of you, comes from the idea that your individual autonomy is very important and innate to you and must not be overtaken at any point in time. Because you understand that your own individual autonomy is important to begin with, you respect that autonomy to other people as well, which is to say, because I understand that I shouldn't be harmed no matter what, I'm willing to understand that other people and their ability to not be harmed is as equally important in this world, right? That's exactly what the birth of altruism gives to you in terms of in terms of the maximum good. But it enables things like individual autonomy and understanding of cultural relations, understanding of any kind of rights in the world that you live in, and otherwise you live in a universally selfish world to begin with. On that, I'll take closing government.
Regardless of what calculus this technology makes, they are safer than humans who are often prone to error. Surely you get more opting into this technology and protection of all lives under this policy.
All right. First, we don't think that's going to come about for two main reasons, right? Because even if human beings are prone to error, they're also prone to the evolution of morality and how objective morality takes place. In a world where universal conception of morality applies to everyone, which means everyone has to prioritize the most amount of lives, you're going to move towards a place where you prioritize things that prioritize the most amount of people in life. So things like collective rights, things like the right to protest, and any other sense of impact of morality that you get on our side of the world happens because you understand the collective importance of people and why that autonomy is good to begin with. On your world, even if you opt in it, what you necessarily legitimize is moral uncertainty that AI have in many cases, right? But why is that important? This is important for two reasons. Simply because you're able to live in a world where you differentiate arbitrarily between what's important, and even if AIs are less prone to error, you're not going to be able to save more lives because it's contingent on you universalizing selfishness to begin with. And that's not a world that we want to live in. But secondarily, on moral uncertainty that AIs have scared us, right? Which means a growing animosity between AI and human beings. And the reason it's it's been to a large extent is because moral uncertainty of AI is individuated in nature and scares us from the evolution of AI and technology to begin with. That's why the evolution of technology in this world has been extremely slow to begin with, because people have been averse to technology. And that happens with religious communities also coming out against it, right? But why that's important is specifically because in a world that has such an animosity, it's going to be a world where you never live in evolution of technology and evolution of the kind of AI that you want that serves a good goodness to people. But lastly, things like coexistence of people and their rights and their inhibitions will never happen on government's world. So what we give you on our side is a more cohesive world to live in, but secondary and a better world to live in. But secondarily, we give you benefits as to why harms as to why this AI will be misused, and harms as to why that's particularly a worse place to live in. Extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you. Let's have member of Gov.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do in this extension is weigh into the principal clash and just explain why, even if you think that all these issues are going to happen all the time, you would certainly save more lives in the circumstance where you decide to prioritize the owner. Now, the logic here is just that the risk probability analysis of AI is much more accurate with regard to saving an owner's life than the life of external actors, which means that when AIs have to make difficult decisions, they're more likely to err on the side of making a decision that is accurate, a decision that will actually save someone's life, as opposed to unnecessarily killing the owner in order to fictitiously save the life of individuals who are never any threat. So the first premise of this argument is just that it is easier to calculate risk to the owner of that technology rather than external actors. There are three reasons for this. The first reason is is that you have far, far more information about the owner than you do external actors. Not only in the sense of what is likely to kill them, because as a car, you know exactly what will kill the owner, and it's far more speculative how that car will interact with the external environment, but you also know more about the owner individually. So for example, you know if they are frail, as opposed to a stranger on the street where that car would have an enormously difficult time identifying the level of danger that person could be in before they died. The second reason is because there is an enormous amount of unpredictability with respect to the external environment. Which is to say that you know what an owner is going to do because the owner is sitting there in the car with the seatbelt on. You know how they will respond to the circumstance. Whereas you do not know, for example, when you were crashing into a coffee shop, where people will move with respect to the car. You know, like you don't know if they will dodge out of the way, where they will go, et cetera, et cetera. And the third reason here is just because all of these decisions have to be made in incredibly split moments. Yeah, like it's just like 0.1 of a second. The AI has to make the decision for the reason that that is really the only time in which you would be able to make a decision that would save anyone's life. And in that circumstance, the previous two factors are exacerbated because it's more difficult to make that differentiation in that case. Our claim is that in a world where the AI decides to err on the side of saving the lives of others, you're more likely to get circumstances where they try to save the lives of others for no reason because the others were not in any danger in the first place, because the AI made a bad calculation, because it's very, very difficult to make that calculation. You can't really train a computer to do so. And as a result, unnecessarily kill the owner of that vehicle. That would happen at such a frequency for the reasons that we explained that it would generate circumstances where far more people died. So that blows the principled claim of this opening half out of the water. The only other thing I briefly want to deal with is just the claim from opening opposition, which is that it's sort of like a 1v5 calculus where should you save one owner versus 5 people outside. It's often not the case that that is the actual trade-off. For example, you could have 5 people in the car and there could be 1 pedestrian. So, you know, they don't really give you a utilitarian calculus through which to make this decision. So I noticed in the chat that OG are here hearing that. They didn't prove that. I promise you, I listened to their speeches. You can credit us with that. Let's move on to the novel part of the extension. Our claim is that you would get far more opt-in to AI technology, which would be far, far better because AI makes far fewer errors than humans in factories and the road, which is basically the only circumstance in which this debate takes place, just factually. And so you would save an enormous amount of lives. But before I explain that, let me explain in advance why this is literally the only important claim in the debate. That is for the reason that the opening half clash is concerned with the circumstances in which AI must make these decisions, but our claim is that they almost will never have to make this decision, like exceedingly rarely, which means that the moral way they make the choice in that circumstance does not matter because it happens so infrequently. 5 reasons why here. The first reason is because this technology still has to be compliant with the law, and the law doesn't make this moral decision in, binary ways, right? The law has a very clear thing that the AI will have to do, so it's only in the situations outside of where the law specifically tells the AI what to do that it has to make a decision at all. Secondly, AIs just will make very few errors for the reason that they have enormous computing power. And for example, in the circumstance of something like road vehicles, they can operate on networks whereby they all interact with one another. So there would be literally 0 problems ever because they know where each other are at all times. Thirdly, these decisions are rare anyway. So even outside of the purview of AI making these decisions, things like the kinds of road accidents where you have to make a decision don't happen often. They much more often happen in a circumstance where either someone dies or they do not die. Fourthly, this debate occurs in the context of regulation, whereby it is exceedingly likely that you would just not have AI making these decisions at all. Like it would just not be structured in such a fashion. And finally, you can just take non-lethal action in the majority of circumstances. AI would be very good at opting for a route where no one died as opposed to anyone died, which explains why the circumstances in which you have to make a moral choice almost never happen, which explains why the principle doesn't matter in this debate. I'll take OO real quick.
Your claim is still dependent upon the fact that AIs are still programmed by human beings through human bias, which means when AI has to make a close call based upon approximation of benefit, it will still err on the side of selfishness of human beings. It's still not divorced from that impact.
Oh, yeah, no, you're just wrong. You just don't understand how AI works because it is not programmed by human beings. It makes its own decisions. That's literally how AI works. For example, like AlphaGo, which is probably the most advanced game-playing AI in the world at the moment, almost has literally 0 human decision-making. It's just presented with opportunities and then it optimizes itself from there. So yeah, I mean, you guys just don't get it. So why will this just annihilate the widespread adoption of AI? This is really simple. Basically, humans are extremely risk averse, particularly in the context of things like new and emerging technologies, which are scary, and particularly with respect to things like driving and factories, which have a lot of danger associated with them. And it is very, very hard to convince them that they ought to opt into that technology at the point at which they no longer feel like it will not kill them. And that is particularly true in the context of it being very easy to weaponize as a narrative against the widespread adoption of AI, for the reason that, for example, the traditional automotive industry would have strong incentives to suggest that new AI that is disruptive, like Tesla, will just kill you in the opposition's world. So that means you lose out on a consumer base, and that consumer base indicates to its government that it doesn't want AI, which means governments are more likely to heavily regulate against AI being put in place in things like factories and on the road. That has the result of a cyclical effect where you do not reach the critical mass required for AI to be adopted widely, because you no longer have the widespread usage of it that encourages innovation and technology to develop to the point where it is much safer, and you no longer achieve the network effect with things like automobiles, whereby cars can just operate in unison with one another. Which means that even if this is a small reduction in the uptake, it still massively affects the extent to which this technology is viable. And that has a very obvious impact of now humans still make errors in these fields and they kill a huge amount of people. Crazy amount of people die on the road. That doesn't happen when AI makes this decision, and AIs make the decision in our world. They do not make the decision when consumers and governments are against them existing in the first place. Very proud to govern.
Thanks. Let's have member of op.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. Just give me 15 seconds. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. First, let's be very clear on what the metric for the AI would be on our side of the world. We think on our side, the metric would be strictly utilitarian. That is, if there are 5 people in the car and the AI knows there is a 100% probability of these 5 people dying, versus if there's a 50% chance of the 5 pedestrians outside dying, means that the AI would then would save the people in the car. If the probabilities were reduced, means that the AI would save the pedestrians and kill the people in the car, which means what we're going to defend is base utilitarianism, and I'm going to give you structured reasons throughout my speech as to why that is the only metric that is relevant in this debate. But before that, few reasons why CG takes a fourth in this debate. Firstly, they had this beyond ridiculous argument that it's easier to calculate the risk to an owner, which is why we should always save the owner, right? Firstly, notice that the mechanisms of a crash are extremely complex, right? You have airbags in a car, you literally have thousands of joints, and it's impossible to predict how a car is going to behave in a crash. On the comparative, you know that if you know that you're going to barge into a number of people at high speed, you probably know that these people are going to die with a very high level of probability. Therefore, it's just logically untrue that the risk, calculating the risk to a large number of owners within the car is more difficult. But secondly, even if this were the true, right, they have given no principled justification on why we should err on the side of the owner, right? Because at the worst case, if we can calculate exactly the risk to an owner, but we're still uncertain about what the risks to a pedestrian are, we can still calculate what the mean value of that risk is, right? Which means we can give a ballpark figure of what that risk is going to be like, and we have to work with that figure. And then the question in this debate is what metric should the AI use to judge those two numbers? Government's burden in this debate was to prove that no matter how many pedestrians were going to die, or no matter what the probability of pedestrians dying was, the AI should always err on the side of the owner, and they haven't given any principal reasons to that effect. Thirdly, they say that the amount of support for AI would decrease, but notice that if consumers feel unsafe on their side, pedestrians would feel unsafe on ours as well. That is uncomparative. But notice this, we think this debate is largely about, because we can only imagine tech that exists right now, it's largely about tech that exists right now, which means it's probably about like self-driving cars and the amount of safety they can ensure to pedestrians and what is the best way to ensure safety within these things, right? Two arguments under this. Firstly is on the idea of consent. Notice that everyone who gets into a car understands the risks of doing so, right? You know that road accidents happen. You risk injury at the point at which you get into a car, but you still choose to do so because you want to make your own life convenient. Secondly, we think the point at which you get into a self-driving car or any machine with AI, you actively choose to give the decision-making power to that AI, and again you make this choice for your own convenience because say you don't want the hassle of driving, which means you actively choose to give that autonomous agency to another being and you actively consent in this transaction. Thirdly, we think that on the comparative, we think pedestrians who are on the street have given far lower degrees of consent, right? Because notice that they haven't chosen ever to share the road with a self-driving car. They're probably forced to walk on the street because they have no money to buy a car, or their government isn't good enough to give them public amenities like footpaths, etc. Which means that if given a choice, they would choose not to walk on that road. This is why OG's argumentation on this being analogous to the trolley problem doesn't happen, because the trolley problem assumes that no one who's stuck on the tracks has consented to be on that tracks. Here, the driver has consented to be in the car, but the other pedestrians have not consented to be in it in the first place. This is why it is okay to pull the lever and save 5 people and kill that one person. Even if you don't buy that, consider this, right? To think of this as a variation on the doctor-patient thought experiment. Here, one person would come to a doctor with five of his organs failing. We think this still wouldn't justify the doctor taking the organs of 5 healthy people to put it into that person, even if that doctor owes a special obligation to that patient. This is why we think that there is no reason. This is the reason why utilitarianism should be the metric of judging this debate. But secondly, on obligation and who this technology has an obligation to. Firstly, notice that we don't think this technology has any obligation to the owner. We think that the owner is not the only agent that the AI owes its existence to. It has been created through large levels of public funding, and it is only possible to have made that AI because there's large degrees of societal support for science, which means that the AI owes its existence as much as to the owner as to the rest of society, which means that the owner cannot claim any special claim, doesn't have any special claim over the actions of that AI, which means that government can't also say that the AI should only emulate actions which or should do what the owner would have done in its place, right? The metric has to be utilitarianism in this debate. But more specifically on OG, notice that OG asserts that AI should mirror that owner's morality and do what that owner should do. But there is literally, they've given no reason why that obligation, why one actor should impose that obligation on others. Right? For example, we don't think robot soldiers would have any reason to commit the same war crimes that their owner would have done, and we don't think that would justify any robot soldiers committing those same war crimes. And therefore, the frame of morality should not be what that owner would have done, but what is moral in terms of society. And we say that frame is utilitarianism for the reasons given above. But finally, notice that we say if the obligation of the AI should exist to anyone, it should be to the pedestrians and people who aren't using that AI. Why is this so? Because AI is an extremely exclusive technology which is only available to the rich and to the privileged. If AI exists only to protect that owners, which means that basically the people who are able to afford AI get an additional level of protection that other people do not. We think there is literally no justification, because this literally stems from the lottery of birth of people and them being so able to or not being able to afford AI, right? We think this is analogous to just giving personal bodyguards to the rich and making sure that they never die on the roads and putting everyone else at far greater degrees of risk as a process. We think this can also lead you to look at it through the veil of ignorance, right? Because notice that you would only want this sort of AI and you would only want Gov World if you think it's likely that you're going to buy a car, or it's likely you think that you're going to drive in a self-riding car. We think the only reason you would do so is because you think you have the privilege necessary to be able to afford this technology and to be able to use it. We think if people were put behind a veil of ignorance, they would probably hedge their risks and choose an outcome where the vast majority of people are protected from such a potentially dangerous tech. We think because you do not owe a special obligation to your owner, and because the owner has consented to be in that car, utilitarianism should be the metric the AI should use to make decisions, which is why we win this debate.
Thank you very much. Let's have Gavwit.
Yeah, just 1 second. Okay, you can hear me just fine?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I fucking hate philosophy debates, and this debate is why. Our opening are probably right about the philosophical clash, but honestly, these questions are so murky, so who the fuck knows? At CG, we provide you the clearest path to victory by telling you it does not matter what philosophical framework you buy into, because we save on net more lives by encouraging people to uptake this technology that is far less prone to error, and therefore things like car crashes on the roads. And that gets people's lives saved. That is the clearest benefit in this debate, and does not require you to weigh centuries of philosophical argumentation. So I'm going to look at 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond directly to the CEO extension first. I'm then going to whip our extension and then deal with some of the front half issues remaining in this debate. First, let's look at what CEO tell us. The first thing they say is, utilitarianism, great. First of all, for an entire extension premised on utilitarianism, they provide very little explanation for why utilitarianism is good. The second thing I'd observe, though, is that I don't think they can just invent a new calculus at CO. The debate simply specifies other humans. It is unclear that this would be the metric by which these technologies would be developed. Thirdly, though, we would say, if you think utilitarianism is a good metric, in like a significant number of cases at least, it would probably be utilitarian to prioritize the owner and other people in proximity, because it just might, like, not every circumstance has like 20 people in a crowded restaurant, right? Like that you're driving into. So utilitarianism could in fact apply on our case. But fourthly, we say that it actually does not matter in the end because of the reasons we give you in our extension, which is that if you're saving more lives on net, it does not require you to make this murky philosophical way up. Then they say, but you've consented. You've consented to be in the car, and you're someone who is very rich because you've had the means to afford a car. First of all, owning something like a car, in a vast number of circumstances doesn't necessarily mean you've made a very active decision, right? Like, people need transport to go to their jobs and things like that. But this debate is not just about cars. This is about all the other things that were specified in the topic, like factories. Someone, who has to work for a living under capitalism does not necessarily have the choice to work in a factory whereby these machines are being used. And to suggest that they've made an active choice, or therefore that they should suffer because of that, I think is ridiculous. So consent does not work here. Lastly, they say there's no obligation. That's fine. We agree. That's not our case. So I just don't think the CO extension offers very much here, and I think that is pretty swiftly responded to. Let's now deal with our extension, which gets very minimal engagement from closing opposition and is hugely problematic for them. And as a reminder, OG touch on the idea that you might need to access this technology, but they provide very scant material about mechanistically why that is the case, and also what the valuable outcome of this is. Ollie explains to you in extension that humans are averse to this new technology, that they often overestimate their competence, and that means there is little take up. That changes at the point where they feel like their safety is being prioritized under this technology, and you get more investment that flows. The massive, massive benefit of this policy, which dwarfs anything that anyone else can suggest in this debate, is simply to say that this technology by far has less error because it is designed by, an algorithm that is, its literal job is to, encourage safety, versus humans who, in like literally every parts of the world always fuck up at factories, always overestimate their own competence when it comes to driving. And that is especially true in like often parts of the developed world where there's just less regulation for those things. So when more people uptake into this technology, you just get more lives saved on net. So you know what, utilitarianism, other philosophies, who gives a shit? We save more lives on net. And that gets zero response from CO and is fatal for them. But the other prong of our extension was this. We think it is easier to calculate risk when you're prioritizing owners for the reasons Ollie gives you, which is that you've got more information, the external environment is unpredictable, and you have to make these decisions very quickly. The outcome being that often you might be trying to save other parties for no reason. And they just say in response, but you know, cars are complex. They have lots of different moving parts, right? I think that is extremely uncharitable to the explanation Ollie gives you, which is just that like you understand what the airbag looks like. You understand that environment far more than you could understand, you know, how someone will run and, you know, run away from a car or something like that, which means, again, our material stands here, which is that you might be unnecessarily killing the owner, and that is bad. And there are a few very clear reasons why this material, both of these prongs win us the debate. One, it is not dependent on the specific circumstance, whether it's a child or this many people or whatever. It literally does not matter. Two, we bypass that extremely subjective philosophical debate about who you should prioritize. And Ollie explains that the sorts of circumstances that are likely to arise that the front half talk about are fairly minimal. So we win this debate very clearly on those prongs. Before I continue on with my case, though, I will take OO.
Majority of your benefits are having autonomous cars. You can still have that. The problem with you bypassing philosophical conundrums is that you literally do not accept the cases in which humans commit error or commit mistakes due to their own benefits. For instance, rash driving, driving under influence. In all those instances, that moral decision ought to be made, and you have to bite that bullet.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, dealing with the front half now, the last part of my speech. So you say you incentivize bad behavior. We broadly agree with our opening government here. We think that you're able to program against this thing. Like at the point where you deliberately swerve into a group of people, we don't have to protect you. But two, criminal law still exists. You still have a range of mechanisms not to go fucking kill people, right? So I just think that is extremely, extremely negligible in this debate. The other things OO say are you need trust in order to development and in order to unlock the benefits of AI. We agree, you need trust. Unfortunately, trust does not go your way. We think more people are likely to trust in AI where they feel a sense of personal safety at the point in which they engage with it. The last thing OO say is, we need to encourage a society that is altruistic and thinks of other people. I just don't think this minimal technology, like that affects a very small part of people's lives, is going to be the tipping point by which everyone starts acting more altruistically. That was just a misnomer in this debate. So again, very proud to propose clear win for CG.
Thank you very much. Let's have up with
Could you confirm if I'm audible?
yes.
Okay, just give me 10 seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I fucking love philosophy debates because even great debaters find it murky, and just because they can't analyze the philosophical conundrums, they are forced to resort to like weird impacts, which I'm going to just frame out of this debate, right? So firstly, I'm just going to quickly deal with O and frame why our extension is easily more important than them, and then move on to dealing with the bulk of material that we get from side government. Firstly, in terms of O's case ends that human well-being is arbitrary and therefore utilitarianism is the answer. Through multiple intuition pumps and through multiple layers of analysis based on consent and based on the fact that humans are forced to operate under incomplete information, through all of those layers of analysis, we give you the answer as to why utilitarianism is the only moral way in which we need to resolve these conundrums. Therefore, that automatically places us above opening opposition. Moving on to government, and I'm first going to just take CG out because I think they've been incredibly irrelevant, probably running for a fourth, right? The first thing that they said is that it's difficult to calculate the probabilities and therefore it's unnecessary to kill the owners. It's literally an AI. It can calculate an expected number of people that are going to be harmed outside the car. The actual number of it can be greater than the expected number or lesser than the expected number. We don't care, but expected number and probabilities are the only thing that we can use to make any decisions, right? That's why just because you can't determine with complete accuracy doesn't mean that you err on the side of the owner, because even if you can't determine with complete accuracy, the harms that you cause to pedestrians could either be more or be less, right? That's why the fact that those things are arbitrary and you're forced to operate under probabilities anyway means that it's extremely ridiculous to err on the side of the owner, right? That doesn't resolve the clash. The second thing that CG says is that moral claims don't matter because this happens a very few number of times. Firstly, that just completely misunderstands what moral claims are to begin with, right? Like, for example, even in extremely even if something happens one time in a million times, the fact that we still have a discussion about it and still have a moral discussion about it means that that thing still becomes morally significant. But regardless of that, this is like literally in every single factory, on every single road in the world, where poor people still have to walk, where pedestrians still exist, etc., which means this decision has to happen a large number of times, right? Otherwise, even the benefits that OG talks about are weird to begin with. But at the end of the CG case, their biggest impact is that people will stop opting into AI, and that will objectively lead to more number of deaths because AI is just better than humans. If we, like in my member speech, if we show to you that from my member speech material, this argument is at best a wash, CG just goes riding down the fourth, right? Why is this argument a wash? Firstly, the analysis that CG uses is that if owners feel safe, only then will people opt into AI technology. But the corresponding logical corollary of that is that if a large number of people who also walk on roads, a large number of people who also go to coffee shops, etc., feel unsafe because of this technology, it will also mean that this kind of a technology will get the sufficient pushback, and therefore the opting into this technology is going to be challenged through those kinds of people anyway, right? But secondly, we just think numerically there's more people who are going to oppose this kind of a technology given the gaps of privilege that exist in our society to begin with, right? Self-driving cars are literally more expensive than cars that exist today, and therefore in all of those instances you are going to get multiple layers of opposition to that kind of an opting in, right? This piece of analysis suggests that at best you probably get some level of opposition on side government because owners feel unsafe. On our side, you get opposition from pedestrians. The only way then to resolve this societal clash on what to prioritize therefore becomes utilitarianism, because that is something each and everyone implicitly consents to, because that's the only way you act in a world with incomplete information. That's where our analysis on utilitarianism becomes extremely important. Yes, OG, I'll take you in the 5th minute, right? At the end of OCG's case, they said car is like a pretty normal choice. That's why consent doesn't matter. But our analysis on consent is different, right? We said that there is an imbalance in consent. When you buy a technology, it is indicative of consenting to all the threats that technology brings to you, right? But most people on the streets, while consent to some degree of risk that, if randomly a car walks in, that's just sad for me, I can't do anything. But they don't consent to this overarching additional risk that the AI is going to make a decision on just to prioritize the owner, right? Therefore, in that imbalance of consent, we think we ought to prioritize utilitarianism. OG said that a human would do the same to protect their loved ones, right? We think firstly, even at that human level, it is probably a questionable choice to begin with, right? And at best, it is a questionable choice only in the individual perspective. At a societal perspective, it's still a morally bad choice, right? Like the fact that you chose to prioritize your relations and your biases over and above other people means that it's still not reflective of societal morality. And therefore, at the end of this argument, OG needed to prove why AI has to be a direct extension of the owner's morality and not society's morality as a whole. We think society's morality in that context has to be then utilitarianism. Before moving on, I'll take OG.
People buy into traffic laws. Most countries of the world have functioning transportation systems. I'm not sure why people, by just virtue of walking, don't consent to being subject to the same safety laws on the metrics that you analyze. That's what your argument is contingent on.
Come on. This obviously, everyone who lives in this world operates on limited information, right? They know, obviously, consent to while walking on the road that because of because of random reasons, if some car walks into me, it's just sad, right? They consent to that level of risk, definitely. But they obviously don't consent to this additional risk that is being imposed upon them, that only the privileged people who are buying the self-driving car or people who are able to afford this kind of a self-driving technology are consenting to, but these people can't consent to that kind of an additional risk, right? That's why, given the fact that there is an imbalance of consent, utilitarianism has to be the answer. The last thing that opening government said is that the stranger you are saving could also probably be a terrorist. This argument is literally ended at that assertion. The flip of it is that the driver could also be a terrorist. We don't care. We ought to go for utilitarianism. Why is the veil of ignorance argument from my member speech completely important and just decimates gov case on a philosophical level, right? We say that given that humans always act on incomplete information, the way in which you determine the morality of a particular action has to be through the veil of ignorance, where you force people to determine their like what they would do given those kinds of probabilities, right? That is to say, if you ask a person that what would you do if there is a 0.01% chance that you are a rich person who can afford this self-driving car, and there is a 0.9% chance that you are walking on this road and you could be killed because the self-driving car prioritizes the owner and not you. Most people, given the risk averseness, in a perfectly moral sense, would obviously choose opposition's world and not government world, because government world doesn't obey utilitarianism and government world protects the people who can afford this technology, right? At the end of this claim, I just like to note that the owner's perspective, even if it's something that the AI is emulating, is not a morally salient perspective to begin with, right? The reason for that is quite simple, because we think we don't want to have AI soldiers which commit war crimes just because human soldiers in some circumstances would. We don't want AI politicians who would just go out committing acts of oppression just because majoritarian rhetoric supports all of those things, right? At the end of all of this, the analysis is crucial. It just means that as a society, we want to move towards a society where technology interacts with morality at a societal level and not at this particular level that OG and O perversely talk about in this debate. At the end of my speech, I just like to note that we are the only team which answers why utilitarianism is the metric, and we are able to resolve all claims that government teams have made. Very proud to win this debate.
Thank you everyone for that debate. That's it. This is a silent round, so you can proceed to exit this breakout room.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.